Hello and welcome to the COVIDENCE UK update for February 2021. My name is Adrian Martineau. I'm the Chief Investigator of the study. So January saw us complete the final send out of antibody tests. Some 15,000 tests have now gone out, and I'm very grateful to Hayley and her team of 20 volunteers who spent long hours packing up these tests. And just as the tests have gone out, so now we are receiving your antibody cards back in the post. And we're particularly grateful to get this message from one of you. It was a really nice surprise when we opened up the package with your antibody card result. So in terms of the outline of the talk for today, I just want to share with you some early results from the antibody study. Then I want to go on to talk about how to interpret the result if you get a positive result back. Then how to interpret the results if you get a negative result back, how your antibody result will be analysed, and to address the question, where is my antibody test result, which is perhaps the question we get asked the most. So to start on that one, let me first of all apologise that the turnaround time for these antibody tests is turning out to be significantly longer than we anticipated. The three main reasons. The first relates to supply chain issues. There are some national shortages of some laboratory reagents which we're using, and even of pipette tips, which are essential for processing the samples. Second, there are some staffing issues. A number of people in the lab have been redeployed as a result of the second and third peaks to do testing for the virus as opposed to antibodies. In addition to which, the team has been affected by absence from work due to COVID or contact with somebody who's had COVID. Thirdly, a major issue is that the lab has competing priorities trying to juggle NHS work with research. So you're probably more interested in what we're doing about it than why we're having problems. And essentially, we're putting into place two major initiatives. The first is to draft in a team of some 15 medical students who are going to take on a lot of the work relating to entering the samples onto the system and ensuring that data integrity is intact. And we're also going to increase automation in that a new analyzer with much higher potential for sample throughput will be arriving in the laboratory from March. So the bottom line here is that we do understand your frustration. I apologise for the delays, but please bear with us, because if you can continue to do the monthly questionnaires, we can link those to your antibody result when it comes through, and that will maximise the value of the data that you've shared with us. So we do have around 1,000 test results back so far, and I'm just going to share some of the early results with you. As you can see from this graph, around 11.2% of those tests have come back as positive, 88.5% come back as negative, and just 3 out of 1,000 came back with a message that we needed to repeat the sample. So I think one of the big take-home messages here is that for people who are concerned that the number of drops or the size of the drops was smaller than you wished, we are still able to process those samples. For the small drops, we actually take a pair of nail scissors, cut round the small blood dots, and then incubate it with a smaller volume of saline to ensure that the sensitivity of the test is not impaired. So we're doing our best to get a result from almost every sample that you send us. Just to put those results in context, let me share with you the results from the REACT study, which is a national survey of seroprevalence for December 2020. And you can see that our finding of a seroprevalence of around 11% is in keeping with results from that study. So I find that very encouraging. It's showing that our antibody test with the finger prick is working as our validation work predicted it would do, and we're getting results which are broadly in keeping with those from other studies using different methodologies. So in the scenario that you get your result back and it's positive, how should this be interpreted? Well, the interpretation depends very much on whether or not you've had a COVID vaccine at the time when you did your antibody finger prick test. In the scenario where you did have a vaccine, a positive result means that your body has mounted a successful immune response to the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus following vaccination. And the presence of antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, however, doesn't guarantee immunity to COVID-19 in the future. So you should continue to follow government guidance to minimise your risk of future infection. The scenario where you have a positive result but you have not been vaccinated at the time you did the blood test, This means that you've probably been infected with the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus in the weeks or months prior to giving your finger prick sample. Similarly to the situation in vaccinated people, the presence of antibodies doesn't guarantee immunity to COVID-19 in the future, and neither does it remove the need for vaccination if you happen to be offered one, since vaccination is likely to offer extra protection over and above that provided following natural infection. So if you have a positive antibody result and you're offered a vaccine, you should definitely accept it because it could offer you extra protection. One thing we often get asked is whether false positive results are possible. And indeed, this is a possibility. However, it's pretty rare. Our validation data suggests that just 0.7% of people, that's 7 in 1,000, who did not have COVID-19 had a positive antibody test with our test. It's not uncommon, in fact, for people to have asymptomatic SARS-CoV-2 infection, as you may know. And most likely, if you have a positive result and you didn't have COVID to your knowledge, it's most likely that you had an asymptomatic infection. What about a negative result? Well, again, interpretation of a negative result depends on your vaccination status. If you get a negative result and you haven't been vaccinated, then your result suggests that you've probably not been infected with SARS-CoV-2 in recent weeks or months. If you definitely did have COVID-19 in the past, for example, if you know that you had a positive test and you had symptoms, and your antibody test is negative now, the most likely explanation is that your antibody response may have faded or waned since the time of your illness, especially if that illness was more than 6 months ago. What about if you have a negative result and you've had a COVID vaccine? Well, this is a pretty unusual scenario because vaccines should stimulate an antibody response, which should again be detected by our test. However, there are a few reasons why you might have an antibody test that's negative even though you've had a COVID vaccine. And let me just run over what those reasons might be. One scenario is that you did your finger prick test very soon after getting the vaccine, so your body didn't have time to mount an antibody response yet. We know that T cell and B cell responses tend to peak around 3 to 4 weeks after the first dose of vaccine. So if you did your finger prick test very shortly after getting the vaccine, it may be that that antibody response wasn't yet mounted. Conversely, it's possible that if you did your test a long time after getting the vaccine, your antibody response might have faded. Another possibility is that you might be taking medicines which suppress the immune system, and these could interfere with your body's ability to mount an antibody response after vaccination. Similarly, there are some medical conditions that can affect the immune system's ability to respond to vaccination. Finally, it's possible that you could have protection from the vaccine mediated via a T cell response, which isn't detectable by our antibody test because antibody tests only pick up B cell responses. T cells and B cells are different types of white blood cell, both called lymphocytes, and the B cells make antibodies, whereas the T cells are involved in coordinating and helping the antibody response to be generated. So we know from studies done at Queen Mary and in other places that there are some individuals who have a T cell response in the absence of a B cell response and vice versa. So if you've been vaccinated but you don't have an antibody response, it's possible still that you've got protection as a result of T cell mediated immunity. Is a false negative result possible? Yes, it is. These aren't common. Just 3.7% of people who had mild or moderate COVID-19 had a negative antibody test afterwards using our test. And most often this arises, as I said, because COVID-19 occurred several months before the antibody test, and we know that antibody responses can wane over a period of months. The final question we get asked a lot is, how will my antibody test result be analysed? And essentially, again, this depends on your COVID-19 vaccination status at the time you gave your blood sample. If you did receive the vaccine, we will analyse your data to answer 2 questions. Number 1, which factors affect the antibody response to vaccination? And number 2, to what extent do post-vaccination antibody levels associate with protection against COVID-19 in the future? And in order to answer that question, it's critical that we continue to get answers to the monthly questionnaires, because if you were to develop COVID-19 in the future, we'd need to know about it in order to run the analysis on that question. In terms of analyses for antibody results in people who've not been vaccinated, one of the major things we can tell from the antibody test is people who've had asymptomatic infection. And so we can ask not just what's your risk factors for symptomatic infection, which was covered in a previous webinar, but we can start looking at risk factors for asymptomatic infection as well. So you might ask, why is asymptomatic infection important? And indeed, that's a very important question, and we're asking it ourselves because having an antibody test linked to the symptoms that you're reporting in your monthly questionnaires will allow us to ask the question, are there any long-term complications of infection that didn't have symptoms initially? And that's one of the reasons why we're asking everybody detailed sets of questions about symptoms typical of long COVID, even if people don't think they've got long COVID. So that explains why in the questionnaire we're asking detailed questions about breathlessness and about fatigue, because we want to pick up if there's some subtle increase in these symptoms in people who had SARS-CoV-2 infection but didn't know about it at the time. The final question we can answer by analysing antibody test results in unvaccinated people is, does pre-vaccination antibody status affect response to vaccination? There's some evidence already, perhaps, that having antibodies before you're vaccinated could associate with an increased reaction to the vaccine in terms of having feverish symptoms or feeling generally unwell. But it might also be that having had a natural infection before the vaccine could augment the response that the vaccine, augment the degree of protection that the vaccine affords you. And by looking at this in COVIDENCE UK, matching your clinical data, your symptom data, and your antibody data, we can get a handle on this question. So the bottom line from this webinar is that the COVIDENCE UK antibody test results are already starting to provide valuable information about SARS-CoV-2 infection in the past. To those of you who haven't yet had your result, please bear with us. We're working hard to process outstanding samples, and we're really grateful for your patience. So please do bear with us. Stick with the monthly questionnaires if you can, and this will maximise the value of all the data you've shared with us so far. So that brings this webinar to an end. From all of us at COVIDENCE UK to all of you who continue to participate in the study, thank you for your contribution. Until next month, goodbye.